Okay, everyone, this is the first of what is probably going to be 3 video lectures for Chapter 9 on cell respiration or cellular respiration. Um, you notice the word fermentation there in the title. We're really not going to focus all that much on fermentation. Fermentation is a way to break down food molecules in the absence of oxygen. Primarily, though, our cells prefer to use cellular respiration, aerobic respiration, in the presence of oxygen because it actually produces a lot more energy from our food. And that's why we're going to focus on that one. So, in this chapter, we're going to talk about, again, cell respiration. This is the primary biochemical pathway that cells use to break down food molecules to extract energy. So you eat something, you eat a meal, those food molecules through digestion are delivered to your cells, and your cells break those down and extract the energy from them and use that to power all sorts of cellular functions. So certainly, life is work, right? Life is work. You see this giraffe here, for example, eating the leaves probably off of an acacia tree there in Africa. Those leaves that giraffe is eating represent bound chemical potential energy. They literally are energy. Now, the plant captured sunlight through the process of photosynthesis and used that to build sugar molecules that then became the basis for lots of other types of molecules. But the point is that through photosynthesis, the plant can capture sunlight and bind it up or wrap it up in the form of a sugar molecule and use that for food. So that's why the plant is making sugar for itself as a source of food. But then the giraffe comes along, or you come along and eat some sort of plant material, and you can get the what used to be solar energy now is chemical potential energy of food to power your systems. But we need the process of cellular respiration to break those molecules down in our cells so we can get access to that energy. Okay. All right. So let's talk big picture here first in terms of what's going on. Okay. So energy is going to flow into an ecosystem mostly as sunlight. Not always, but typically that's the case. So it's going to flow into an ecosystem of sunlight. You see that right here. And it's going to leave ultimately as heat. Okay. But what's going on with that energy while it's in the ecosystem? So as far as an ecosystem, we could be talking about a coral reef, a grassland, a forest, tundra, deserts, you name it, right? In all those cases, you have energy coming in as sunlight. So what we need is a process to capture that sunlight and convert it to food for us. That process is photosynthesis, and it happens in an organelle called the chloroplast. You see one here. The chloroplast, which is located inside of a plant cell. This is why plants appear green, because of their chloroplasts. Okay, we're going to talk about that in a lot of detail in chapter 10. So first of all, you can't have just energy. You need building materials. So plants will take carbon dioxide and water. In the presence of sunlight inside the chloroplast, they will build that CO2 and water into organic molecules, namely sugar molecules for the most part. And they produce oxygen as a byproduct, which then goes off into the atmosphere. Okay, now the plant, or you if you come along and eat the plant, will then take those organic molecules, sugars for instance, and move them into the mitochondria. The mitochondria of the cell is where cell respiration occurs, right here. Cell respiration in the mitochondria. The mitochondria will then break down those sugar molecules, releasing energy, some of which can be bound up as a molecule of ATP. But then also, as they break that sugar molecule down, they convert it back to CO2 and water, which can then be taken up again through photosynthesis and more sunlight to convert it back into sugar molecules, and the cycle continues, as you see. Now, this oxygen that's produced over here by plants is used during aerobic cellular respiration. Aerobic means using oxygen. And that's why we breathe. That's why we breathe in oxygen, because we need that at the cellular level for our mitochondria to be able to break down food molecules. Okay. Now, of the amount of energy in a sugar molecule, typically about 35 or 40% is ultimately used to build ATP molecules, which then go and spend that energy to do cellular work. The other 55 or 60, or I'm sorry, 60 or 65% usually goes off as heat. This is what your body heat is that you're giving off right now. Okay, it's energy that your cells could not get access to because cellular respiration is not 100% efficient. It's about 35 or 40% efficient, but that's pretty good as far as efficiency goes. Okay, so cells are going to use chemical energy then stored in organic molecules like sugars to generate ATP, and that ATP then powers cellular work, muscle contraction, movement, any sort of cellular work you can imagine. All right, so let's talk about the pathway in general for cell respiration. Now, we talked in chapter 8 about anabolic and catabolic pathways. We said that catabolic pathways are pathways that tear large molecules down into simple molecules and release energy in the process. Cellular respiration is a catabolic pathway, and it basically produces energy by carrying out a process called oxidation. Okay, we'll see more about that here in a moment. But catabolic pathways like cell respiration release stored energy by breaking down complex molecules, sugars mostly, but also proteins, fats, various other things. And so you might be asking, well, what really is the energy content of these food molecules? Well, it's the electrons. Okay, so we've talked about how important electrons are, earlier in this course for understanding the way atoms behave in terms of reactivity, the way that atoms bond to each other and cause shapes of molecules to be what they are, and so on and so forth. Here we see another really important aspect of electrons. Electrons are really nothing more than pure energy, and they represent the energy content of our food. So when we break down our food molecules to extract the energy, we need to be able to extract electrons from the food because they represent the energy. So I want you to think about cell respiration as a mining process. It's going to mine our food for its electron content. Okay? So if we have a metabolic pathway, which we know is a long series in this case, of smaller chemical reactions, we need to have a way to get the electrons out of the food molecules, and then we need to have a way to pass those electrons from one molecule to the next, one intermediate to the next, until we finally get to the end of the process where all the energy that can be taken off of the electrons or out of the electrons has been taken out. Okay, so electron transfer is a really important part of this, removing electrons from food molecules and transferring them down the pathway. All right, we'll get to all that here in a little bit. So first of all, I mentioned the fact that breaking down organic molecules is a catabolic process. So it's catabolic, but it's also exergonic, which means it releases energy. And this is the key point here. It's exergonic, releases energy. If we can find some way to trap some of that energy so it doesn't all go off as heat to the environment, we can then use it. That's exactly what cellular respiration does. All right, so the kind of respiration we're talking about here is known as aerobic cellular respiration. Aerobic meaning that it uses oxygen, okay? So it breaks down or consumes organic molecules and oxygen, and it produces ATP. Think of ATP as the energy currency of the cell. Our cells spend ATP for its energy content in the way that you spend money to have services done or buy things or whatever, okay? Now we also have another category of respiration called anaerobic cellular respiration. It can be similar in a lot of ways to aerobic, but it does not require oxygen. Okay, it can use other compounds instead. So organisms that are anaerobic can live in environments that are anaerobic, meaning no oxygen, and they do just fine. They can break down their food even though there's no oxygen. We can't do that because we are aerobic organisms. We require oxygen. Okay. All right. So cellular respiration, when we use that term, it includes both aerobic and anaerobic respiration. But for the most part, when we say cellular respiration, we're referring to aerobic because that's what our cells primarily do. That's what most cells on the planet primarily do. And that's the most efficient form of this. It produces the most energy from our food. Now, all types of organic biomolecules that we've talked about, carbohydrates, fats, proteins, nucleic acids, can be used as fuel to run aerobic cellular respiration. But typically, sort of by convention, we always show a sugar molecule in sort of coming into this process. So here's the formula for this, okay? So we have C6H12O6, so it's a glucose molecule. We combine that with 6 molecules of oxygen, and we get out, as the sugar breaks down, 6 molecules of CO2 plus 6 molecules of water plus energy. And that energy is in 2 forms, partly ATP, partly as heat. Okay, so that is the balanced chemical equation, chemical formula for aerobic cellular respiration. You can see the oxygen being used right there. Okay, you should be familiar with that chemical equation. All right, so now we're going to talk about kind of go back a little bit and talk about this as a mining process, right? I said think of cell respiration as a mining process. It's going to pull electrons out of our food because they represent the energy content. Okay, so what we're going to talk about next is a category of reactions called redox reactions. Okay, redox reactions. Redox is short for reduction and oxidation. Okay, so we have a reduction reaction, we have an oxidation reaction. They kind of go hand in hand with each other in tandem, so we call them redox reactions for short. Okay, redox reactions are all about transferring electrons. All right, so in an oxidation reaction, what happens is that a substance loses electrons or is oxidized. If I tell you something is being oxidized or is undergoing oxidation, that means that substance, whatever molecule it is losing electrons. In reduction, what we have is the reverse. In the case of a molecule being reduced or going through a reduction process, that simply means that that molecule or whatever it is gaining electrons, okay, or it's being reduced. It's referred to as reduction or being reduced because when a molecule gains electrons, which has a negative charge, that reduces the positive charge the molecule has, okay? But here's a simple way to remember this. Oil rig. Oil rig stands for oxidation is loss of electrons, reduction is gain of electrons. If you remember that sort of mnemonic device, oil rig, that will help you a lot in this chapter and the next chapter. Okay, oxidation is loss of electrons, reduction is gain of electrons. So let's look at an example of this. This is an example we actually saw back in chapter 4 or chapter 5, I believe. No, I'm sorry, chapter 2, where we were talking about different kinds of chemical bonds. I talked about sodium and chlorine and the reaction between them where they form an ionic bond or joined by an ionic bond. And I said that sodium loses 1 electron and therefore goes back to a complete second electron shell. That electron goes to chlorine, which then completes its third electron shell. So that 1 electron movement completes both their outer shells and makes them both more stable. But in the process, sodium then becomes a positive cation and chlorine becomes a negative anion. And those opposite charges are why they stick together through the ionic bond. That's how we talked about this. But now let's talk about it in terms of redox. So when sodium loses that electron to chlorine, the sodium becomes oxidized to a sodium cation. Remember, oxidation is loss of electrons. Sodium lost an electron, so it's being oxidized. Chlorine gains sodium's electron, picks up an electron, and therefore becomes reduced to a chlorine anion. It's gaining an electron, reduction is gain, so it's being reduced. This is a very simple example of a redox reaction. We didn't talk about it that way back in chapter 2 because we didn't need to. We were talking about this in terms of ionic bonds, but it certainly is a redox process. Okay, another way to think of this is in terms of reducing agent and oxidizing agent, okay? So the electron donor, whatever is giving up the electron, like, for example, sodium in this case, can also be referred to as the reducing agent, because in giving that electron to chlorine, it is reducing that chlorine to a chlorine anion. So sodium is what's doing the reducing by giving chlorine the electrons, so sodium is therefore the reducing agent. You could also think of chlorine in terms of being an oxidizing agent. Think of chlorine as taking the electron from sodium. So if chlorine is taking sodium's electron, that is causing sodium to be oxidized. Oxidation is loss of electrons, right? So chlorine, in taking sodium's electron, is causing sodium to be oxidized. Chlorine, therefore, would be considered the oxidizing agent. Okay? That's another way to think about it. Chemists and biochemists tend to think of it that way, but in just general biology, we tend to think of it in terms of what's being oxidized and what's being reduced. All right? But you might see some of this terminology, so it's useful to know it. Okay, now, there are some redox reactions that don't actually transfer electrons, but they actually change the electron sharing in covalent bonds. An example is the reaction between methane and oxygen. Let's take a look at that. I'll get my slide to change. Sorry, guys. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay, so here's the example. This is still an example of redox, but in this example, we don't actually have one molecule losing electrons and the other one gaining. We do have electrons moving either closer to or further away from various atoms. That's also considered redox. So if you look at methane here, for example, methane is CH4. You can see that we have basically non-polar covalent bonds because the electrons are being shared equally by the carbon and hydrogen, right? They're shown right there in the middle. Notice the distance between the electrons and the carbon. That's the important point here, okay? Methane is going to react with oxygen. So methane with 2 molecules of oxygen, you get basically an explosion because methane is natural gas, and that's the reaction. You end up with CO2, water, and energy released, right? This is why we burn natural gas in furnaces and things, for the energy it releases. Okay, but in this process, methane is going to be oxidized to CO2. More specifically, the organic carbon of methane is oxidized to inorganic carbon as CO2. The oxygen becomes reduced to water, all right? Okay, so what's going on here? Again, notice the electrons, right? Notice how far they are from carbon and how far they are from oxygen. So as this reaction goes forward, this carbon ends up right there. That's the same carbon atom, okay? And notice now that in CO2, this carbon is surrounded by 2 very electronegative oxygens that pull the electrons further away from it, right? There's a lot more distance here between this carbon and those electrons than between the same carbon when it was in methane. So the carbon, in a sense, has lost electrons. Electrons and negative charge have been pulled away from it. That is also oxidation. Oxidation is loss of electrons. Now, the oxygen, note the distance here between it and the electrons. These are 2 oxygens. They both have exactly the same electronegativity. They're sharing them equally. Now, there's some pretty good distance there, but as the oxygen then ends up in a water molecule, and there are 2 of those, 2 water molecules, each oxygen is now no longer bonded to another electronegative atom. That's hydrogen, which isn't really electronegative at all. So now the electrons have moved closer to the oxygen, whereas here they were quite far away from it. Now they're closer. So you can think of the oxygen, therefore, as picking up or gaining electrons, and therefore the oxygen is reduced. All right. So in this example, you actually see where the electrons are going, right? But what if you just had the formula here, and you're trying to figure out, well, what's being oxidized and what's being reduced if you weren't told? Here's how you can do it. Follow the hydrogen, okay? That's a key rule. Follow the hydrogen. Where hydrogen goes, electrons go. So notice that the oxygen here has no hydrogen around it, but the hydrogen is in the methane. So this carbon is already in reduced form. It has hydrogen and therefore electrons around it. But as it goes through the reaction, the carbon loses its hydrogen, which also tells you it lost its electrons, because where hydrogen goes, electrons go. The oxygen did not have hydrogens around it, So that was the oxidized form, but then it ends up associated with hydrogen, so you now know it picked up electrons and therefore is reduced. You follow the hydrogen, where hydrogen goes, electrons go, and that will tell you when you have a formula like this or an equation like this, what's being oxidized and what's being reduced, okay? Whatever gains hydrogen is being reduced, whatever gains or loses hydrogen is being oxidized. Okay, so during cellular respiration, the fuel, typically shown as a glucose molecule, like I said, is oxidized and oxygen is reduced. And this is all about electron transfer, as we've said, okay? So here you see it, right? This is our formula. So we have 1 molecule of glucose, 6 molecules of oxygen. Put those together and you get the reaction going forward. You get the glucose being broken down to smaller things like CO2 and water. You get the oxygen ending up in water. It helps to go to produce water, but importantly, you have a lot of energy released, okay? So you can see that this carbon was originally surrounded by hydrogen. Now it's not, so it's being oxidized. The oxygen picks up hydrogen and therefore electrons, and so it's being reduced, okay? So you need to get this straight. What's being oxidized, what's being reduced, what oxidation and reduction actually mean. Okay, so importantly, if we're talking about this overall as a process that pulls electrons out of food molecules like glucose, we need to talk about what happens to those electrons ultimately and during the process. Okay, ultimately the electrons are going to go to the final step of cell respiration, which I sort of refer to as the power plant step. Okay, so think of this process as an analogy for it. Think of like a coal-fired power plant, right? A power plant, they burn coal in to produce heat that causes water to be converted to steam. High pressure steam then turns turbines, which generates electricity. That's how a coal-fired power plant works. Well, if it burns coal, they probably have to get coal to the power plant, right? Okay. So think of cell respiration, the first parts of it that we'll talk about, as a mining process. If you're going to get coal to burn your power plant or in your power plant, you have to dig the coal out of a hillside somewhere, out of a mine, right? You have to transport that coal to the power plant. So the first few steps of cell respiration are about mining electrons, aka the coal, out of our food, and then transporting those electrons to the power plant step, which is then using their energy to make ATP. So we have to transport those electrons just like a barge or a rail car would transport coal to the power plant from the mine, right? This analogy is very apt. It works very well for this, okay? This means that we need some sort of vehicle for carrying electrons in the same way that coal has to be moved by a barge or a rail car. Okay, so we have 2 molecules that are called electron carriers. The first one is called NAD+, okay? The name is actually nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. It's a mouthful, don't worry about it. Everybody just calls it NAD+. All right, NAD+ is a coenzyme. It's a molecule that helps enzymes do their jobs, all right? But think of it as an electron bucket. It carries electrons. That's all the more complex way you need to think about NAD+, okay? It's a bucket that carries electrons. Now, NAD+ is the oxidized form, okay? That is the oxidized form of the molecule. So if it's oxidized, that means it's not carrying electrons, right? Oxidation is lost. It has been oxidized. It has lost electrons. It's an empty bucket. So if we add electrons to it, in other words, reduce it, then we refer to it as, you guessed it, NADH. Remember, follow the hydrogen, right? NADH is the reduced form of the molecule. It's the full bucket form, okay? NAD+ is the empty bucket, not carrying electrons from food. NADH is the full bucket form. It is carrying electrons from food. Okay, so if electrons are being added to NAD+, we're then reducing NAD+ to NADH, right? Reductions, gain of electrons. And electrons represent potential energy. So which of these 2 molecules, NAD+ or NADH, do you think is higher in potential energy? NADH, because it has electrons. They've been added to it. So it's higher in energy. It's more unstable than NAD plus is, all right? Okay, eventually NADH, think of it as a full barge carrying coal to the power plant. Eventually NADH is going to dump those electrons off to the power plant step, which we'll get to toward the end of the chapter. And the power plant step is going to use that energy from those electrons to make ATP. Okay, so let's take a look at NAD plus and NADH. So here on the left, you have NAD plus. It's a complicated molecule. You don't have to memorize the structure of it, but notice this portion here. Okay, this is the part that carries the electrons. So if we have cell respiration freeing up electrons from food molecules, like this apple tissue, for example, okay, those electrons and hydrogens end up being loaded into NAD plus, reducing it to NADH. You see a new hydrogen there. And again, where hydrogen goes, electrons go, right? Specifically, these are hydrogen ions, H+. They're positively charged, electrons are negative. What do opposite charges do? They attract. This is why the two follow each other through this process, okay? This is why it's possible to see where the electrons go by watching where the hydrogens go. Okay, so over here on the left, we have the empty bucket form, the oxidized form, NAD+. We add electrons and hydrogen to it through cell respiration. We reduce NAD+ to NADH. Now we have a higher energy form, okay? All right. Now also notice that this reaction can go backwards. So when we went from left to right, that was reduction of NAD+ to NADH. But NADH needs to be able to unload those electrons at the power plant step, and that is oxidation of NADH back to NAD+. Okay, we need to be able to dump off those electrons and oxidize NADH back to NAD+. Okay, so in the power plant step, which we're going to talk about a little bit here, what happens to those electrons? Well, basically, they're going to be unloaded from NADH through oxidation, like I just said, and they're going to be passed down what's called an electron transport chain, an electron transport chain, okay? This is basically a molecular machine that is going to extract the energy of electrons as they're dumped off by NADH to the top of this machine, okay? You can sort of think of an electron transport chain in this way. Let's think of this analogy. Let's say you're standing at the top of a staircase and you have a bucket of ping pong balls. The bucket is NADH. The ping pong balls in the bucket are the electrons, right? So your bucket's full of ping pong balls. It's reduced. It's in reduced form, full of electrons. You kick it over and the electrons bounce down the staircase. What are the ping pong balls do, rather? As the ping pong balls hit one step and the next, you hear them doing this. You know they're giving off energy as they fall down the staircase. They get to the bottom, they spill out onto the floor, the landing, and eventually they stop, which means they've lost all that potential energy that they had when they were higher up at the top of the staircase, okay? So the electron transport chain is like a staircase. NADH, the full bucket form, dumps its electrons off at the top. They go from one step to the next, and give off their energy, just like the ping pong balls do as they bounce down the staircase. The difference is that in the staircase, all that energy goes off in the atmosphere as heat and sound waves, vibrations, and none of it's used. In the mitochondria, which is where the transport chains are, there are proteins that capture or help to capture some of that energy the electrons are giving off as they move down the transport chain, okay? That energy is captured and used to make ATP, and that's the power plant step, all right? So what are the steps in this electron transport chain, like the steps in the staircase? They're individual proteins. The electrons move from one protein to the next. It's a series of redox reactions. When the first protein or step in the staircase, the transport chain, gets its first electron, it's being reduced. But then it passes that electron to the next protein or step in the process, and the first protein's oxidized, then the second one is reduced, and so on down the line. So it's more redox, okay? Now, why are these electrons moving down the chain? Because they're being pulled. It's not gravity causing this. They're being pulled by what? Oxygen. Oxygen's electronegative, right? We've talked about that a number of times. Oxygen sits at the bottom of the transport chain. It's electronegative. It pulls those electrons down the chain, forcing them to give off energy. Okay, that's why you breathe. If you ever wondered why we need oxygen, that is the answer right there. It makes our transport chains work. It allows our transport chains to extract energy from electrons so we can use it to make ATP. Okay? All right. So, why is this useful? Well, or why are transport chains useful? Electron transport chains are useful because they break the energy release of electrons into manageable units. They extract the energy from electrons in a piecemeal fashion. Let's look over here on the left in the case of an uncontrolled reaction. If you combine hydrogen and oxygen in a container and put a spark to it, you'll get an explosion, right? An explosive release of energy in the form of heat, light, and pressure. And you get water produced as a byproduct. The thing is that all that energy is released so rapidly that it's difficult to contain it. It's difficult to capture any of it and really use it, okay? In the case of cell respiration on the right, the electrons are passed off at the top of the transport chain and they go from one protein to the next, all the way down, and their energy is sort of sapped away in small amounts, in piecemeal fashion. And because it's coming off slowly and in small increments, it's easier to capture a larger amount of it and use it to build ATP molecules. This is a controlled release of energy in this case. Why are the electrons moving down the chain? Because oxygen is sitting down here. The electrons come off the chain, join up with oxygen, and don't forget what's following them, hydrogen ions, protons, right? And so the electrons, the hydrogen ions, join up with oxygen, and what do you get? Water as a byproduct. That water that's produced is called metabolic water. We're all constantly making water as we break down our food molecules, and it just contributes to the total water balance in our bodies at any given moment. Okay. All right, we're going to talk about that in a lot more detail toward the end of the chapter when we get into how it is exactly the transport chains work. I think that this is a good place to stop. We're about a third of the way through this. This is a good place to stop. In the next video lecture, number 2, we'll start talking about the various different phases of cellular respiration.